So hello, everyone, and thank you all for coming to today's talk. I am so excited to have you all here. I hope you're excited. Thank you, brilliant. I know you are. I know some of you were at our earlier events, and if you're free straight after this, I hope you'll join us for the disco with the incredible DJ Harry Gay from Queer House Party. As you can see, I've already got my disco set up. You can probably notice as well, I did shave my pits, but not my chest or my beard. I can't help that, and I don't care. I just want to remind everyone to keep their mics off whilst I'm talking. I don't care about anyone else, to help keep the background noise to... I made this makes me sound really arrogant. I am, but I don't like to put off that kind of vibe. But with us here, we also have Locke Holdrick, who is our fantastic events marketing volunteer. And they have QD in front of their name, as well as the inimitable Hannah Ayres, who is the co-founder of Queer Disrupt with me. That's how you do an introduction, by the way, Hannah. And between us, we attempt to do something along the lines of convening. So if you love our events, you can thank us for that. And if you hate them, I have no idea who runs the group, and I'm so sorry about that. I'll have a word and see what I can get back to you with. So I literally wouldn't have been able to organize the day without Hannah taking a bollock load of stuff off my hands. That is the technical term, a bollock load. It's a good handful like that. So a massive thank you does go out to her. And if you do have any feedback, there are going to be some forms going out, and would really appreciate it if you could fill them in and get us back. They take about 3 minutes, and they actually do really help us. We also have a hashtag, which Hannah will be sharing in the chat, won't you, Hannah? So yes. So this evening's event is in a bit of a kind of mix and mashy kind of crazy way, and takes place in a couple of parts. So first of all, you'll hear me natter at you for a bit, and my talk kind of comes in two parts, but I imagine it'll take about 35 minutes. The first half is longer than the second half, so don't worry, by the time we get halfway, quotation marks through, you don't have to be like, oh my God, I need to listen to them carry on anymore. Where basically I will give a really quick rundown of how and where disco kind of came from. And then the second half, I want to think about what makes disco kind of queer. And I mean queer in the broadest sense of it, and much broader than just like the fact like, oh, LGBT, woo! So I kind of really want to dig into that and think about what makes disco kind of super special. Then I'll be introducing Josh Leach, who is my support bubble, and also so is here today because someone needed to take me into this, and is an amazing animator as well. And I also wouldn't have been able to organize the day without Josh being just kind of the mental and emotional support, as I've been on the verge of mental breakdowns. So a big thank you to Josh as well. I'll be asking a few questions for a few minutes. Then I will be streaming a music video that Josh has animated, but there's going to be more about that later on, don't worry. And then finally, we'll swing open to any questions, comments, compliments that anyone has before wrapping up. So before I get going, a couple of disclaimers. I am not a music expert. So any mistakes are, I was going to say my own, but I don't make mistakes. So I have done a lot of research on it, but I'm not an expert. I'll be lying if I said there weren't any gaps in my knowledge. Also, I'll be swearing a lot because that's just the kind of person I am. And I will be referencing drugs a lot because that's the kind of person I am. And a lot of it took place in the 70s. So on to the main event. Disco. I'll wait for Kimberly to come in. Do you want to admit, Kimberly? Brilliant. Thank you. I'm not going to sit here and have someone interrupt me when I get going. Anyway, first things first. Disco is the product of the late 60s and 70s. I promise you it gets more interesting than this, I swear to God. Most people interested in disco would claim the disco heydays between 1969 and 1979, even though the term disco music, as we understand it today, at least, wasn't used before September 1973. In a Rolling Stone article by Vince Aletti, I'm going to throw names at you, by the way, feel free to ignore them, called, this article was called Discotheque Rock 72, Party. It had 5 A's, I'm not just being obnoxious. Hopefully, there we are. It kind of draws, the word disco draws on obviously the French word discotheque, which literally means a collection of records, and we're kind of used as a building to go dance at now, much like bibliothèque is used as a collection of books, which we also know as library in English. So I've got a couple of quotes here that kind of describe it in this article of the kind of scene there was. So we have the best discotheque DJs are underground stars, discovering previously ignored albums, foreign imports, album cuts, and obscure singles with the power to make the crowd scream and play them overlapped non-stop so you dance until you drop. Me too. And party, party, you hear they chant at concerts rising like a tribal rallying cry on a shrill wave of whistles and hard beating tambourines. It's at once a call to get down and party, a statement that there's a party going on and an indication that discotheques where the chant originated are back in force. So we have the name emerging, but it's really clear that this culture that we're calling disco already existed. So what is it? Well, disco now, as we acknowledge it, is a style of music we often recognize as having like a really strong kind of steady beat, a load of synthesizers throughout, some strings and some bass creating a tune. There's normally a bit of a horn in there, and there's a vocals by some sort of diva on a group that covers themes such as sex, love, and empowerment. However, always a however, disco was so much more than that. It was an entire culture, right, and feeling, and it was created, and where this kind of culture existed. Disco wasn't just about music, but the community that came with it. So this begs the question, who was this community? Well, this community came out of the collision between two quite different scenes. We have the gay liberation scene, and the kind of, and I use this with quotation marks to be really clear, harder or rougher R&B street scene. This, in turn, led to what we all now think of as a night out dancing. Dance music, like as a genre, was a direct result of disco music and its influence on the music community at large. Now, I want to paint a scene just prior to the disco revolution, and I will be calling it that, a revolution, even if it was like a slow revolution rather than kind of, you know, French cutting off the heads of people and happening really quickly. So before disco, the dance scene, if we can even call it that, was, well, stagnant, frankly, compared to the eyes of a modern nightclubber. Yes, there were dancing, and yes, there were places to dance, but these dances were along the lines of things like the waltz or the foxtrot. Yes, these are screenshot from Strictly. Or even the slightly more raucous Lindy Hop, or even the jive. Well, what do we notice about all of these? Well, they're all partnered, and they're partnered between a man and a woman. These dances were specifically designed for a man and a woman to dance together, and that's it. Now, let's compare it to a disco dance floor, which you just saw there. This one is Studio 54, I will come back to later. And Studio 54 does have a lot of problems. We will get back to that, even though I am doing Studio 54 Coke Adult Whore as a look tonight. So, as you can see in this picture, thank you, Sam. My cousin is laughing at me. Like, do not encourage me as Coke Adult Whore. Her too. So anyway, you can see on this picture here, it's a proper mix of people. This isn't a straight couple only dance floor. This is a mixed dance floor. And if you actually look in about round the middle, near the bottom, maybe about 2/3 down, there's a couple in white, full on making out, right? They're two men, and the one on the left has his arm around a third. So there's clearly like something going on there. Leave that to the imagination. But to stress how different this was from before, like, I cannot overstate that. Basically, before December 1971, in New York, it was illegal for members of the same sex to dance together. Although it was often men who were most penalized. And there was even a quota at the door of discos, which meant there had to be a ratio of 1 woman to every 3 men, okay? And they would literally have people sat on chairs around the dance floor, almost like lifeguards, right? With flashlights, shining the light at people on the dance floor. And if the light shone on you when you were, you know, grinding off with some other guy, You had to kind of like fly away from the place or like risk being fined. It was absolutely ridiculous. So this kind of like movement shifts from this waltz and the foxtrot. And I asked the question, how do we get to this kind of like sweaty dance floor of bodies rubbing up against each other that we see here? Well, we can thank this person here, David Mancuso. Some of you may have heard of this person, some of you may have absolutely no idea who this is. But to say that he was one of the most important people in music over the past 100 years wouldn't be an understatement. So on Valentine's Day, 1970, this gentleman here opened up for the first time a truly infamous nightclub in New York called The Loft, for an event which was called Love Saves the Day. Now, The Loft was literally just his apartment in Soho in Manhattan, right? And he became known for basically having the most incredible house parties for a few reasons. To quote him directly, LSD played a very large role, but also he had a kind of non-exclusivity entrance rules. So although the party, sorry, my tit is falling out. So although the party was invitation only, he didn't actually prevent any specific groups of people coming. One second. He didn't actually prevent any specific groups of people coming. And the fact that it was his house and he wasn't selling alcohol or food there meant he wasn't subject to the licensing laws. So he would stay open all night. And I mean all night. Which, when I was reading about this, I kind of have this image. I've got a friend in Berlin, right, who lives above this absolute tosser, who keeps playing music until 6 in the morning. And my friend goes nuts because it's awful. And I just have this image, right, of my friend living in the same apartment block as this guy. And just like, all the time dealing with this guy. Anyway, just imagine living in the same apartment block as him. I'm sure you would not think he was innovative then. Anyway, this flat became the place to go after the clubs closed. And people used to turn up from all over the city, including celebrities, like you've probably heard of Divine, the drag queen. So Vince Aletti, who was the same one who coined the term disco in the article above, described it, and I'm quoting here, it's like going to party completely mixed racially and sexually, where there wasn't any sense of someone being more important than anyone else. And Alex Rosner, who's a famous sound engineer, described it as, and again I'm quoting, probably about 60% black and 70% gay. There's a mix of sexual orientation, and there was a mix of races, and there was a mix of economic groups. It was a real mix where the common denominator was music. Well, the point was that this was the first ever, what we would now call, house party. Mancuso had a literally world-class audio system in his flat. Bear this in mind for everyone else living in the flats, in the apartment building as well. And he would just blast it out, right? Choosing music he felt he needed to be played rather than music which was designed to sort of control the ebb and flow of a dance floor in a club. Which often kind of alternates between like slower songs and then, or did at least, slower songs and quicker songs. The idea being everyone gets up and dance, and then it slows down, and everyone goes get a drink, and then you come back, and yeah, this is really gone down my tits. And then everyone comes back and dances some more, and that. He was just like, nah, mate, I'm not even selling any, and just went for it. And this kind of crazy house party set the kind of tone for the nights out that people started desiring. Okay, so whereas clubs have been this kind of super exclusive kind of vibe before in terms of what you expect and the type of clientele, they started becoming more inclusive, or at least giving the impression that they were. And this meant that clubs became more desirable overall. And you had clubs like Sanctuary, Paradise City, and the Gallery, which kind of became the place to be. By the way, Sanctuary on the left there literally took place in an old abandoned German Lutheran church in New York. Like, I just love the idea that people were just popping pills and going nuts and just like generally pissing off God in his own house. I did try and find a picture of like the Gallery, but although there were like loads of photos online, I couldn't actually find any that I could actually go, yeah, that's actually the gallery. Because all the pictures seem to kind of contradict, they didn't look like the same place. So I'm sure there are pictures out there, but I unfortunately couldn't find it. However, to give an example of the kind of vibe, people went out there not purely to spend money, but to kind of have like an experience. So you kind of went out and you danced with the kind of girl, the guy you fancied. So although drinks and still kind of the aim of the club and like making money, it was still a completely different feel. The gallery, for example, these numbers are drawn, by the way, from people who used to go there, would charge $7 entry to get in, which in the early 70s was regarded as pretty good. In today's money, for people who are wondering, that's about $50 US or about £35 in kind of British pounds, modern day, which sounds a lot, but for an entire night out isn't bad, considering that a joint or a tab of acid was another dollar, so about another £5 or $7.50, right? And that would be it for the night. So that's still under 50 quid, which, considering the amount of money that people spend today, isn't incomparable. In short, these parties and like these drugs, these kind of party or club drugs, as I've heard the kids call them, kind of help create this kind of atmosphere of dance. And all of this was heightened, of course, by the new music that was brought about when DJs started becoming a whole new thing. So brought on by Mancuso's house party at the Loft. As I said before, a DJ's job primarily was to play music and have this kind of talk or slow song and then get back up to dancing. But this new style of music took on a completely different take. The DJs instead of directing the crowd, started responding and listening to the crowd much more, who were already pushing to carry on dancing. So how did the DJs do this? Well, they started blending and cutting music, okay? This sounds really obvious today, but this was kind of really new at the time. So often what they would do is they would buy 2 records of exactly the same song, and they could artificially flick between them to make it last, in theory, forever. So they'd have a dance break on, say, record number 1, and as that was wrapping up, they would start the dance break on record number 2 and shift over. As that's playing, they'd be moving record number 1 back to the beginning of the dance break and shift back and back and forth and back and forth, in theory, keeping the music going as long as they needed. Now, these dance breaks that they're pulling on primarily came from the R&B influences of the era. So, for example, the rhythm you're probably most familiar with when it comes to disco is what we'd call the Earl Young disco beat. That's Earl Young there, what you might know as the 4 on the floor rhythm. Now, if you haven't, that's fine. I can guarantee you have heard it. It's a really common beat. I'm going to sneeze in a minute. No, I'm good. Where basically the bass drum hits every single beat in a 4/4 rhythm. Like, well, that's a lot. A really good example of this, which I did share with you, is Disco Inferno. Earl Young was the one who wrote that song, and he was the one who introduced this particular boom, 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 boom bass drum. Also really famous on I Will Survive when that kicks in. And if you don't know that song, just leave. If you don't know this song, after this, leave and listen to it. It's amazing. So this mixed in with the R&B influenced rhythm with the politics of and culture of gay liberation as well, kind of got this new vibe. And remember, this was just after the infamous Stonewall riots of 1969, and Pride marches started in 1970. Disco, remember, really kicked off from 1969 onwards. Add to all of this a really hearty splash of feminism and the massive increase of the use of the contraceptive pill in the mid to late 60s, leading to this kind of level of sexual freedom that had kind of been unheard of before. And we have this kind of amazing clash of culture. We have these music genres, social liberation, pride and feminism, and it's all kind of riding on this wave of fun and drugs and sex and these kind of hippie summers from the 60s. And this all leads to the sound that we now know as disco. Now, everything I'm explaining here and describing was a sound that took place in the US, in particular New York, but people in the UK as well, and Europe more broadly, hello all of our European audience, lovely to have you all here, are also getting more and more excited about this kind of new wave of music across the pond. So what started happening? DJs started flying to the US, New York in particular, specifically to go to the disco and gay bars, basically, to try and find new music to bring back, which is kind of fucking awesome. Like, that's just something that wouldn't happen today because of the internet, right? And I guess this lovely idea of getting on a plane and being like, oh my God, I'm going for an adventure to explore this kind of amazing new music, right? So what this then meant, I know there's lots of this kind of meant, when the DJs came back and they would go back to their respective clubs, they all had their own take on it. So DJs started to develop a really signature style, right? And a kind of evolving the type of music that you got. And a really good example of this would be, I don't know if you've heard of it, but Northern Soul, which is basically a style of disco that came about from Blackpool. And it kind of had this British influence mixed with US New York disco. This is literally how Northern Soul came about. Now, you are all getting the idea now, I am sure, that there is a lot going on. And all of this is really exciting. Record labels at this point now are also starting to pick up. We're moving more into the mid-70s here, okay, on this kind of new culture, and they're going, well, how can I capitalize on that? Because, yeah, neoliberalism. So we end up with songs such as Donna Summer's Love to Love You Baby, which you'll all know as well, which was released in 1975 and originally went on for 17 minutes, just so people could dance and grind to it without the DJs having to cut and fade between them. Now, I don't know about you, but I have met, wined, dined, dated, and fucked men in less than 17 minutes. So you can really imagine what they were getting up to on the dance floor in that time. But what we actually end up with in realism is 15 minutes of a dance break with Donna Summers moaning orgasmically, with 1 minute either side proclaiming her desire to love me baby, basically. And much as I do joke about this, the song does help introduce the theme of female eroticism and feminine empowerment, which becomes a massive reoccurring theme in the lyrics of disco. And I will turn back to that. My tit is falling out again. Oh, there we are. Now, I am arriving at a super, super key year now. 1977. I know, don't all jump up and cheer at once, I'm aware. This was basically a year where everything kind of exploded in disco, kind of like in the disco scene. Oh, there's a bike backfiring outside. And this was without a doubt the year disco really went mainstream. Okay, so in 1977, 3 things happened. 1, Studio 54 opened. I will come back to that. 2, Saturday Night Fever was released. And 3, bringing back Donna Summer again, she released another song called I Feel Love, which I also shared in the email links. I don't know if you listened to it, but you will be aware of it. And I'll touch on all these kind of individually, but all of these played a massive role in the shaping of disco as we understand it. Ooh. Now, Studio 54, first one, opened in 1977 in Manhattan and basically became the place to go. It became really famous for its super restrictive door policy, based heavily on how you looked and who you are. And as I'm sure you can probably tell already, this couldn't be further from Mancuso's loft house party, right? Where it was primarily gay people and people of color. Now, this became the haunt of primarily, but not exclusively, primarily white, wealthy celebrities. And if you look at the guest list at the time, it's a literal who's who of celebrities, from like Michael Jackson, Cher, David Bowie, Mick Jagger, Dolly Parton, and Freddie Mercury, to fashion designers like Valentino, Lagerfeld, Calvin Klein, to people like Donald Trump, sorry, find that little gag reflex, Donald Trump, Al Pacino, Divine again, and even, weirdly, Salvador Dali. but you know, are you surprised looking at his pictures? I've got some pictures on the screen there, and as you can see on that one on the left is literally Liza Minnelli, Bianca Jagger, Andy Warhol, and Halverstown, who's a fashion designer, right? Amusingly, the really famous song Le Freak by Chic, you know, freak out, blah, blah, is actually a criticism of this elitism. After they were basically refused entry on New Year's Eve 1977, despite being invited by Grace Jones. And she basically forgot to tell the door staff. But Nile Rodgers from Chic said the original lyrics were not Le Freak, but fuck off, and was about Studio 54. My point is I'm trying to get, Studio 54 became a very elite, but very hedonistic space to like the nth degree, to the point where sex was like common on the dance floor. And there were rumors that cocaine used to be pumped in through the air conditioning units, which the owners did deny repeatedly, obviously. Secondly, Saturday Night Fever was released. The famous movie with John Travolta. This was huge. And shaped the perception of disco like beyond belief. Gone was this big community spirit that made disco separate from previous dances like the Lindy Hop. Think back to the pictures I showed you earlier, when it was just one man and one woman. But instead, John Travolta is now strutting onto the dance floor, grinding his hips again, and using it as a way to try and seduce women. It managed to reassert all the very types of dancing that disco originally managed to subvert when it first came about. Now, the Bee Gees album, the soundtrack, was one of the best-selling albums of all time. Okay, it sold 40 million copies, and it stayed on the Billboard album charts for 120 weeks, so over 2 years. So this kind of solidified the place of disco in the universal cultural imaginary. Disco was now not just something in the clubs, but was also a full-on household phenomenon. And finally, Donna Summer releasing I Feel Love. This was one of the songs I shared in the email link. So if you haven't listened to it and you don't know it, feel free to listen afterwards. Now, this one might not seem as obvious as the other two things in terms of the importance of what happened, but it was still incredibly important. 1 second. It was co-produced and co-written, spitting glitter, by the Italian producer Giorgio Moroder, which might not be a name you're necessarily familiar with. And if you do hear the song, you will know it, I'm sure. This song completely revolutionized the way that disco music was being created. It was almost unrecognizable as having any instruments that weren't completely electronic, although they were there. It was hugely layered. Okay, and the almost entirely synthetic sounding bass line shaped the entire future of European disco moving forward. The drum beat was deliberately out of sync and was played through different speakers. So you'd have the actual drum beat on one side, on the left speaker, and then a split second later on the right-hand side, you would have the repeat. So it kind of was a very short delay, which gives it a really unique sound that is almost impossible to replicate by hand. Okay, so this was a distinctly European style of disco music and basically the foundations of European music. And if you've listened to electronic dance ever, or new wave, or synth pop, or techno, or house, or trance, this song influenced it. Okay, the Financial Times called it one of the most influential records ever made. Slant ranked it amongst the top greatest dance song ever, and The Guardian called it one of the key events in the history of dance music, claiming it was, and I'm quoting here, one of the first to fully utilize the potential of electronics, replacing lush disco orchestration with the hypnotic precision of machines. And it also helps the fact the song is a fucking banger. Yeah. Just thinking about this actually, earlier today whilst quoting this on, I was listening to Chromatica by Lady Gaga, and actually Stupid Love and a huge amount of that album draws so much on this kind of style of music. Now, I'll be kind of starting to wrap up this first part of my talk in a moment and move on to like the shorter second part, where I start thinking about what about disco is queer, aside from its kind of like wild origins. But I kind of have to mention Sylvester as well as the Village People as kind of key figures as well, and both from 1978. But I won't go into a huge amount of depth here, because whilst they were both kind of in some ways progressive and able to kind of push boundaries of representation, they both did it, and I imagine not entirely by choice, in a kind of safe way. That is, they were still marketable, in short. Randy Jones from the Village People, who's the cowboy, basically, openly said that all of their performances contained lots of kind of self-aware like nods and like winks to the audience, to let them know there was all a joke, and they weren't really going to the YMCA to hook up with men in showers. It's all a big joke. So whilst they were very well known, I'm actually relatively unsure on how groundbreaking they were at this point. And this moves me to the 1979, the last part of the disco heyday era, with the Disco Sucks movements. This was a big moment, recently covered really badly, I might add, in RuPaul's Drag Race US with their disco-mentary. In short, various demographics of society had had enough of disco. And despite it going more mainstream, it was still attached to this kind of quite threatening demographic, i.e. gay men and black people, the two scariest things for white conservatives in the US. Now, this movement was undoubtedly shaped by racism and homophobia. There is no doubt in my mind that this is what helped drive this. And it culminated basically in a riot at the Chicago White Sox baseball stadium. You can see it here, hosted by shock jock Steve Dahl. Now, Dahl had a long hatred of disco, although he was often controversial just for the sake of it, just trying to keep himself relevant. Think like Milo Yiannopoulos. He was racist, he was deeply unpleasant, and frankly, I don't want to spend more time on this, but the relevant bit of information here is he campaigned for this, and he hosted this, and he told fans to bring their disco albums to the stadium on July the 12th, 1979, for a disco demolition night. More than 50,000 fans turned up, primarily because there was a massive discount offered, which is if you bought a disco record to be destroyed, you could get in for $0.89, which was the frequency of the radio station he was at. Okay. Anyway, as a marketing employee, it worked. I mean, I'll give him that. In between the baseball games that evening, they blew up all the records from these two massive containers in the middle of the stadium. And you can see signs there as well hanging up on the left-hand side of that picture saying disco sucks. After the blowing up, basically, fans charged the field, refused to leave, and then started vandalizing the stadium, and they had to call off the second game. So, you know, who knew that encouraging violence would, could lead to something like this? Ooh. Anyway, of course, disco didn't really die. It did gradually fade from the height of popularity, as many music genres do. However, it is still popular today, and I'm sure you're aware. But this is where my brief history of disco in part one of my talk ends. Part two is much shorter, don't worry, you don't have to listen to my dulcet witch cackle for much longer, but I kind of want to think about what made disco, well, so queer, basically, aside from its LGBT roots, I mean. And I use queer here, by the way, as a verb. I like to queer things, and I like to play with norms and fuck with binaries. Look at me right now, I'm fucking with the binary as it comes. And this is kind of where my PhD research starts to show through. And I could talk about this stuff for hours, so I'm going to be really careful and try and stick on script. Otherwise, I will go off on one, and we'll be here till 10 o'clock. So I think one of the things I really want to think about is the idea that the dance floor, that is a ceiling, I'm aware, dance floor became an entirely new space with disco. And this was joined in with the idea that the social dance floor that we had, that got away from these kind of straight parents before. Now, to me, this is super interesting, as it meant the dance floor becomes a whole new space to occupy, where those who are on it can engage with one another away from the strict one man, one woman binary that society insists must exist even today. Think of how many people say things today like, oh, men and women can't just be friends, or men are from Mars and women are from Venus. Like, it completely binarizes and separates the sexes and genders and blasts them to, in the metaphor above, literally different planets in the solar system, right? However, the disco dance floor went, fuck all y'all and your stupid expectations. I'm here because I want to shake my ass and I don't care who I'm here with. Great. And it instead blasts apart the way that people expect one another to interact and severs this binary between man, woman, and all of the gender and the sex and everything that comes about. But it did, at least until Saturday Night Fever came around, which then managed to undo a load of this work. But in this space I'm conceiving of, the dance floor is new, a temporary community space away from the rest of society. It's fluid and autonomous and sexy within this kind of broader social space of the nightclub or wherever the dance floor is. And it moves from someone dancing and others watching from the sidelines, like in a ballroom dance, like where those dancers were kind of like surveyed and observed. And I remember the flashlights in New York when they used to watch the dance floor, to a form of dance when the separation between these two completely collapse, right? Voyeurs are gone. Like, you're not just on the dance floor watching it, you are on there in the show, right? You are voyeur and performer for other voyeurs, and you are present in the moment, right? You can dance and sweat and touch and grind and seduce, and it's just like the most amazing feeling and time. And for me, that's super duper queer. There's also a theorist I'm going to draw on called Richard Dyer, who you don't need to know much about if you don't know, but in the 80s, he wrote a thesis called The Defense of Disco. And in that, he drew a comparison between rock music and disco. And he argued that rock music was male-focused, or what he called play to the sexuality of the cock. Disco, however, through its crazy fun rhythms, this sort of played to the sexuality of the body, and the body for both sexes. So the actual quote he uses is, its eroticism allows us to rediscover the bodies as part of this experience of materiality and the possibility of change. Basically, Dyer is saying that the erotic nature of disco lets us all be in touch with our bodies in a way we couldn't be with previous genres of music. In short, to quote Lizzo, I'm feeling myself, okay? Now, again, I want to point out this place of this dance floor as being super fluid and fun, and it blurs the binaries, and people of all races and sexualities could mix and merge and fuck and play. And this was a space that allowed full-on mixing and destroying of everything that restricted people and personhoods and those stupid boundaries, right, that stop everyone from being just who they are. Okay? I mentioned earlier as well that the female and feminine sexuality in the lyrics and empowerment became key features of disco. Think again of Gloria Gaynor's I Will Survive as the kind of quintessential song. The lyrics and this dance floor fluidity meant that whilst these lyrics were undeniably feminine, loads of people could embrace the meaning behind them. Gay men, for example, who were often dismissed as feminine, were able to tap into these now feminine lyrics and reclaim their so-called femininity in a really powerful and self-affirming way. And everyone else who disagreed could go get screwed, okay? Now, there's another theorist you might have heard of, but don't worry if you haven't. Jack Halverstown, who wrote a book called In a Queer Time and Place. This is just a funny image I saw online with the caption, "Can queer people time travel?" And it just made me laugh so much. So this is my image for Queer Time and Place, where he mentions that under the cover of night, away from the neoliberal heteronormative structures, the darkness allows a playful experience, which is a really, really wordy way of saying that once the sun goes down, the queers and misfits come out to play, okay? Dance music, which was, remember, what disco became, then becomes a space for all the queer misfits to get together and lose themselves in the music. And I'm sure we have all here ourselves lost ourselves in music or dance or book or just something artistic and creative. And the next thing you know, hours have passed and you're like, what the fuck? That was the most incredible time. Now, in the 70s, this space was disco music and the disco dance floor. before it got super mainstream. And I am under no illusion, by the way, that the copious amounts of those party drugs, ecstasy, ketamine, cocaine, and LSD, played a massive role in that. And these drugs are still really popular with underground dance and rave cultures today. So I'm told. So finally, I want to talk about the dance floor and the nightclub and explore how disco queers the typical relationship we expect from people in a nightclub. And I want to look at very briefly the idea of two theorists. Again, don't worry about the names. Dailies and Guattari, who I like to imagine as like my friendly gay uncles that you see in the corner at a family wedding that are actually really cool, but no one understands anything about what they do and a little bit too scared to ask questions. But they came up with this idea of a body without organs, which Tim Lawrence, another theorist, don't worry about the name, argues is a way of thinking about all that I discussed just now. And I won't go into the specifics of the quotes because it's wordy and complicated. And if you read it, you start to understand why no one invites your friendly gay uncles to weddings, because they just make your head hurt. But basically, the dance floor is a messy, crazy body which flows and becomes its entirely own entity. That is, it becomes its own body that you can kind of slip in and out of and between, and it's a space without rules and regulations outside of itself. So it can be anarchic, it can be sexy, it can be scary, it can be pleasurable, rebellious, joyful, and everything in between. And the DJ does this. I read aloud how Vince Letty described the chanting of the crowd in his article as party, party, the one where he first coined the term disco, and the DJs responded to that. Now, the editing of the dance breaks, as I said earlier, and the songs with the call and response of the audience integrates the very infrastructure of the nightclub onto the dance floor. The entire club becomes this body without organs, right? And the DJ responds to that, which the dancers and the people in the club respond back to, which the DJ responds to again, and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, like the disco, the vinyl discs that this DJ is sort of shifting between. And you end up with a completely ephemeral, once-in-a-lifetime experience that will never be exactly reproduced in the same way again. The DJ and audience interaction queers how music is recorded and was expected to be played. The DJ doesn't just put on a track that you can hear at home, but instead mixes live for the audience and to the audience. So we don't get song A, and then song B, and then song C, and then song D, and so on. Instead, what we now have is song A with the dance break of song C, and then the chorus from song Q, and the outro of song F, which is also the intro for song B, then back to A, and so on and so on and so on and so on. And the music stops being discrete items to hear, and instead disco fucked with the structure of music and the way we experienced it. And now this brings me to my summary, okay? And I'm thinking about, this is just a pretty image, there's nothing particularly exciting about that, but it did make me think of the one before. And I was thinking about what it is that I love about disco. And I came to the realization that, and this will sound really odd, I admit, given the fact I've just spoken to you for ages about it, but I actually don't like disco music that much. The odd song, yeah, but the genre as a whole, not hugely. What do I love then? Well, it's this spirit of disco and everything that represents that I love. I wasn't even alive, right, when disco was in its heyday, so I don't think I'll ever be able to fully grasp exactly that experience, but I have had similar experiences. I think disco tapped into the psyche that everyone has and carved the channel of escapism for people at the time. Remember, despite this being a relatively progressive movement, it still took place in a society where racism, homophobia, sexism, etc. was absolutely rife. And I think many of the people disco sort of embraced were looking for their escape. And nowadays people have their own ways of escape. I think it's telling that disco really attracted marginalized people. For me, for example, My favourite memories of lockdown, and they are few and far between, is actually laying back with my support buddy, Josh, who you'll see in a minute, and he doesn't know I've written this, with dance and trance music playing in the background, with my eyes shut and the lights off, just losing myself to the music. And those times were not about being on a physical dance floor, but instead with losing ourselves to the music at the time and spending that time in a collective space. Both of us jointly experienced that feeling of losing ourselves to that time and space. And it was unique and ephemeral, and we would never be able to return to that if we tried to force it. Now, that for me is the spirit of disco, and one that I think we can all find in our own ways, especially in this kind of quite difficult times. So, if there's one thing to take away from this talk, find your disco, right? And find those things that let you escape the world that is currently going to hell in a fucking handbasket, right? And then lose yourself to those simple pleasures that you find there. Thank you very much. I actually can't see any of you, so like, I'm assuming you're applauding and it's all good. Before I stop sharing the screen, please do have a look, please follow us. Please, I'm sure Hannah's probably shared it in the chat as she's munching on what looks like a donut or a biscuit. Hashtag queer shout, okay? I'm going to stop sharing